Thanks very much. I feel a little odd following such a beautiful and let's say optimistic presentation by throwing a spanner in the works and talking about some of the negative aspects of memorialisation, especially in a geographical area where some of the battles that were fought in the Second World War were unresolved and were resolved through the politics of memorialisation in part after the 1980s. And in particular, I'm going to look at the independent state of Croatia, NDH, which is modern-day Croatia, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it's always important to remember that this fascist state included Bosnia and Herzegovina. During the Second World War, when the independent state of Croatia was under fascist occupation, particularly by the Ustaša regime, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about them in a minute, approximately 75% of the Jewish community of that state were killed, up to 17% of its Serb population, 6% of Croats, and 9% of Muslims. But when we look at the timing of the war and the way in which these killings took place, we can see that this is a process. The Ustaša in particular targeted the Orthodox Serbian population, Roma and Jews, and set up a camp, Jasenovac. But it's at the end of the war that the large number of Croatian casualties happen, and these are crimes which are committed by the communists, by the partisans, as they liberated the country. And I suppose where we have the memory wars in Croatia is over the problem that we all have with the definition of genocide. I think we're going to talk about this later today. It exists, and we use the term, but I think we have to acknowledge as scholars that there's an enormous gap between popular conception of what genocide means, i.e. the entire annihilation of a population, and the legal definition, which is much narrower, that is, intent to destroy in whole or in part. So clearly we have genocide in the independent state of Croatia during the Second World War, and I think Tomislav Dulic, a scholar who's based in Sweden, has talked about attempted genocide, which doesn't quite get us around the main problematic, as we'll see when we look at the example of Jasenovac. There is also, at the end of the war, the elimination of the German population of the independent state of Croatia. Entire villages, such as the small town of Windhorst in Bosnia, where the population are expelled, and in violent circumstances. Now, one of the things that the Ustaša regime did was to set up a concentration camp, and this is partly modelled on Vjekoslav Luborić, who was a key ideologue in the Ustaša regime's visits to Germany. He actually looked at what was, he toured the eastern parts of the occupied territories and looked at what was being carried out. And in many respects, Jasenovac was simply like the other death camps. But I think one of the ways in which we might want to start thinking about the Ustaša regime is slightly differently, because the Jasenovac itself was, as a camp, was the site of significant disorder, I suppose, in terms of that way in which crimes were committed. I think it might be more pertinent now for us to think of the Ustasha regime something similar to the sort of things that ISIS are doing in the Middle East, because a lot of it is what we might call wild acts, particularly the cult of the knife. So there's a lot of decapitations and throat slitting. And when the communists reached Jasenovac, they moved in. They found piles of emaciated bodies, extensive evidence of widespread abuse and torture, including photographs. So intent to destroy was somewhat easier for them to establish. And they did not have to invent the crimes of the former regime, since they had left an evidence trail. And I think this is also very important, because as the partisans moved through the north of what became Yugoslavia, they also committed significant war crimes themselves, including, as I said at the beginning, attacks on the Croatian military, and a likely destruction of 6% of the Croat population, which mostly occurred at this time. Jasenovac was a very important part of the way in which the communist regime that came to power in Yugoslavia in 1945 thought about the past. It was a very important legitimizing site of memory for them. The other thing that they particularly did also was to chase fugitive war criminals. So they they hunted down Vyacheslav Luburic, who'd gone to he'd gone to Italy and then to Spain at the end of the war, and they eventually caught up with him in 1969 and assassinated him. And this was part of a very ruthless spate of killings by the communist regime. They went round, hunted down war criminals. They also made a particular point of putting war criminals on trial. So this was a continual reminder to the public in Yugoslavia of the Second World War. And if that phrase, history is written by the winners, is true, it's particularly true in this case. And in 1986, they put Andrija Artukovic on trial in Zagreb, and he had been in the States since the 1940s, and the Yugoslav authorities had continually lobbied the Americans for his return, and by the time he got to Zagreb, he was very elderly and very infirm, and actually was given a death sentence, but the state decided he was too frail to carry this out, so he died 2 years later in prison. Through the trial, the government was able to revive a collective disdain for the crimes of the Ustasha regime. Now, notoriously, in the 1980s, the future Croatian president Franjo Tuđman gained some notoriety as a revisionist of the numbers of people killed at Jasenovac. And I think one of the things that was happening at this time was an attempt, particularly by Croatian nationalists who saw the crimes of the Ustasha being singled out by the regime, to try and think about the people who were killed at the end of the war. So what they were trying to do, by revising the numbers killed down, was to try and equate the crimes of the communists to the crimes of the Ustasha. I think perhaps that's the best case scenario. Perhaps initially Tuđman, who revised the numbers killed in Jasenovac down by about half the known number who were killed in the camp. probably wanted to try and rehabilitate the Ustasha regime in some way. And of course, when he became president, the Israeli government were particularly vigilant about the way in which the newly elected Croatian government used the past. Because, you know, in the first few months after his government were elected, they attempted to name streets after Ustasha ministers, and the Israelis immediately protested. So there was a sense in which they were trying to push a rehabilitation agenda, and it was unsuccessful. And during Tudjman's period as president of Croatia, there was also another significant war crimes trial. And this was of Dinko Šakić, who had been one of the commandants of Jasenovac. Also very elderly, although not quite so infirm, and he was to spend a decade in prison. But he was one of these compulsive, in the end, like with Adolf Eichmann, his compulsive tendencies, and he gave an interview on Argentinian television. He'd escaped to Argentina, actually scuppered him, and he was tracked down by the Simon Wiesenthal Trust and taken eventually to Zagreb, where he was also put in prison. And for those of you who follow the Hague Tribunal, it's a very important ledger of the war crimes in Bosnia in the 1990s. The similarities between Dinko Šakic's attitude towards the court, you know, the contempt, you know, the pushing away of the evidence and so on, and the sarcasm and the irony is very similar to Ratko Mladic, or at least it reminds me of that. I think the most controversial thing about this trial was, well, first of all, his denial of the evidence, but also the role of the church, the Catholic Church, who continually publicly forgave, I suppose is the kindest way of putting it, Šakić. And when he died, he was given a full requiem mass, and the priest that buried him and also stated, rather controversially, that he was a Croat who other Croats could be proud of. Now, this is in contrast with the Jasenovac memorial itself. Which is an important site of memory, and the museum itself, they preserved the evidence, including a lot of the weapons that we use for torture. And I think now, with successive Croatian governments, it has become a place where the past can be reconciled, if you like. People can go there, and more recent Croatian presidents have tended to go to Jasenovac for memorials which have been, I think, respectful of the memory of the dead. So I think, to some extent, the problems that we're talking about in the 1980s and 90s have actually passed, and that the past can be remembered in a more respectful and also accurate way. But remembrance of the Second World War became a significant battleground in communist Yugoslavia, and continued to be so after 1990, when the state split into separate nation states. It could be stated that some of the remembrance revived the divisions that existed already in the 1940s, and the battles of the 1990s and the Civil War were fought about political issues that had emerged earlier, especially with regard to borders between nations. Arguments revolved around key sites of memory, war criminals and fugitives from justice, as well as the extent of the Jasenovac's camp and the numbers that died there. Nationalists used those sites of memory to stage debates and television debates which kept them alive in the public mind. Okay.